How's it going, everybody? This is Aaron the Pedantic, and today I'm going to have a discussion on 5th edition ability acquisition. It's not a crap post like the last one. So I'm going to start off by saying I know that the issues that I have with the way ability acquisition works is not 5th edition exclusive. So if you come in here saying, well, Aaron, in past editions of D&D, they had this problem too. I know that. I'm perfectly aware. Well, let's start with ability acquisition. What is ability acquisition? Well, quite obviously, it's the acquiring of an ability. Existing class structure is something that has this in spades. For instance, whenever you level up as a wizard, you automatically get new spells. It's not something that you are just better at learning spells necessarily. You actually get new spells. Subclasses do the same thing in a lot of situations. It's not that you necessarily just get better at something, it's that you end up getting new abilities completely. Same thing with feats. There are feats that do this as well. And whenever you multi-class, obviously, because the existing class structure already has this stuff built in, whenever you multi-class, you're going to be bringing in new abilities. And these can be kind of jarring whenever all of a sudden you have something new. There's a concept called ludonarrative dissonance. Not everybody knows what it is. I often have to look up the definition to remind myself exactly what it is. It's one of those, I know what it is when I see it, but I don't know how to explain what it is sometimes. But in general, what it means is when the game's mechanical elements do not match with the game's narrative elements. This is something that I think was coined in like I don't know, to the late 2000s, and it was really a term that had to do with video game design, but it absolutely matches with tabletop game design as well. Basically, using the game as written, 5th edition as written, there are many moments that ludonarrative dissonance can happen just because of the fact that you level up. For those who don't know, in 5th edition, whenever you get enough experience points, you take a long rest and then you level up. Well, what this might look like is you might, all of a sudden, finish fighting some things, take a rest, take a long rest in a dungeon, and then boom, all of a sudden you have these new abilities that you couldn't do the day before. Well, what really changed? What changed during that time? In the past they had this thing called training rules. This was in AD&D first edition. It was I recently learned an option in second edition, and I think that was a grave mistake. But basically, there were training rules that said if you want to level up, what you actually have to do is you have to take a certain amount of time, usually a few weeks, and you have to pay for a trainer in order for them to teach you new things so that you can actually develop new abilities. And furthermore, there were a lot of times that you did level up. What happened in AD&D first edition was you would get better at things that you can already do. Once you become level 1, once you start at level 1, a lot of that stuff is already there. It's just that you get better at it. You didn't get new spells when you leveled up in AD&D first edition. You had what was called magical research, and this was something that's been around that was in basic D&D as well. And I want to say probably OD&D, but I'm not an OD&D scholar. But it is in Swords and Wizardry, and Swords and Wizardry is basically OD&D. Somebody can chime in the comments about OD&D. For those who don't know, it's original Dungeons and Dragons. Anyway, rather than having those kinds of rules built in, like they were in first edition, where it said you need to train in between levels, there's nothing there in 5th edition other than long rest. And what happens, and I know this from experience because I've been there, is that this leaves a gap in the ludonarrative harmony that could exist that a lot of people don't know to fill. They don't know necessarily until maybe they're in the middle of running the game and they start noticing, oh, that's kind of weird, actually. All of a sudden, they're developing all these really weird skills and abilities. And maybe it's only been a couple of weeks since we started playing. It's just they keep on hitting encounter after encounter after encounter, getting that XP, getting their level ups. And, they went from, absolute peasants almost to all of a sudden they're almost demigods. And a lot of people don't really understand that until they kind of look back and they're like, "Oh, maybe that's kind of weird." Some people just don't think about this stuff at all. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing if you're just like, I have no problem with, wizard leveling up, getting new spells just because they slept and they just thought about it. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. Again, this is where a lot of people make that comment. If people are enjoying themselves at their table, then, why criticize? Well, I'm not criticizing their table. What I'm doing is I'm trying to open their mind to other possibilities. And the reason is because these are things that I had to learn myself, because I left those gaps unfilled. And then I started feeling like things felt a little strange. Well, whenever you have training rules and things like that, some people might say, well, that's complexity I don't want in my game. Well, the good news for you is that after talking to a lot of people that played AD&D back in the day, a lot of people ignored training rules. And there's nothing wrong with that either necessarily. Now, I know people in the Broas are going to get upset, but people can choose to do that. And it's, in my opinion, much easier for the game world, for the game system to incorporate these things that we can choose to take out if we don't want them, uh, than for the expectation to be for us to make these considerations for ourselves and then not just realize later on after the fact, wow, actually, whenever I was running those games, that actually felt kind of weird. It was kind of silly in a lot of ways. I think that is a better way to go in some instances. Or to at least just have suggestions, guidelines, something in there that says, whenever they're getting this ability, that you might want to like role play it or something. A lot of people will say your DM can have you role play it, so why complain? But again, a lot of people focus primarily on mechanical rules. They may think to themselves, I can multi-class into a fighter because I have this strength requirement, without really thinking about, well, all of a sudden I just picked up a new fighting style. I picked up the ability to wield these kinds of weapons I couldn't wield effectively before, and it's only been a day. They're not really thinking about how to incorporate those things because the game doesn't suggest that you should necessarily. So obviously, whenever I was talking about feats, like I said before, it's not just feats. It's also multi-classing. It's also just different things that you get whenever you level up. I'll give you an example. Subclasses. Whenever you are a fighter who gets the XP to turn to level 3, you could suddenly become an Eldritch Knight. You couldn't cast spells yesterday, but now you can. Or you could become an arcane archer. Whenever you shot your arrows yesterday, they weren't magical, but all of a sudden now they are. And even worse, whenever there's some kind of narrative suggestion that's built into it. For instance, the arcane archer has the concept that you might have learned these things from some kind of elf people. Well, I mean, were you around elf people yesterday when you when you were level 2? No, that was in the past. You just suddenly came to the realization or something. This is, again, why I think it would be better to just have the rules there to begin with. I would say that in a lot of ways, the way that AD&D First Edition was built and designed suggested that Gygax kind of believed in ludonarrative harmony in many instances. Not every instance. I'm sure that people can find something that doesn't quite make sense. For me personally, I always felt that the idea that you've suddenly turned this level, now you're going to have a whole bunch of followers flock to you, and that kind of thing. Those kinds of rules were always really strange to me personally. But there are many instances that these narrative considerations and these game element considerations perfectly aligned. For instance, like I said before, with the magical research thing, for those who don't know, basically in AD&D, you would have to, as a magic user, roll to see if you were able to learn certain spells as you level up. And it wasn't that you were going to learn them if you passed them. It's that you could learn them. These are things that you could figure out if you had the appropriate scrolls. And even in the absence of that, there is the fact that you would roll to attempt to learn spells that are new. Whenever you learn a new spell, period, you have to take time researching them. It's going to cost money. It's going to cost time, and maybe you make some new spells and things like that. Because I mean, they don't just come out of nowhere. They aren't just inherent to the world. There's something that you can create if you're a magic user, because that's what magic users do. That's how spells exist and all that kind of stuff. It all intermingled, and I think that that was awesome. Now, there are other issues that I brought up. So my other issues with abilities, and not just feats, but other abilities, period, are whenever they seem to stem entirely from the desire to have a specific game mechanic, and they aren't really that easily plausibly explained. Although I have learned, thanks to my conversations with James, shout out to Ash of Creativity, you should go check his stuff out, that he and I completely disagree on what some things may seem more plausible than others. For instance, I called out Elemental Adept, and I said that it makes it look like, oh, I've got super fire. Well, the problem that I have with that is trying to explain how it is that you can bypass a resistance, but you don't just have a harsher version of something, especially whenever you're talking about elements. Whenever you have something that is resistant to something, then that means that they have an inherent natural quality to not be as vulnerable to something. I'll give you a real world corollary, because that's often the easiest way to explain these kinds of things. Not corollary, a real world tie, or something, and that is the fact that as humans, or as mammals in general, we can often be more resilient to extreme cold weather than reptiles. And I mean, reptiles often don't have, I mean, if they're cold blooded, they don't have ways to regulate their own body temperature. They require that extra level of those things. And that's why reptiles can freeze to death very quickly. And for humans and mammals, it can take hours, and it can be pretty rough thing. Um, this is something that whenever I try and think about it, like think about a some kind of creature that is well suited for an extreme hot climate. For me to just introduce a fire spell that is going to hurt them, in spite of the fact that I have a hard time understanding. Is it because it's just magical? Well, whenever we think of things that are just magical, it really doesn't take into consideration the elemental aspects. Well, so if that was the case, then couldn't we just ignore immunity? No, we can't. The only thing that we can do there is we can say, well, you're not actually resistant to it. I'm going to hurt you anyway. If they drain that kind of magic element, then that kind of element, I should specify, then does that mean that they drain more of it because you're just presenting a stronger version of it? No. That's not how it happens. Instead, the desired result seems to be, well, those pesky fire elemental resistances that we have built up in the game all over the place, we'd like for people to be able to be a draconic sorcerer that just picks a whole bunch of fire spells and still be viable, because they want to play a super cool fire mage. So because of that, we would like to just put in this mechanic so that way they can do that. They have the option, and it doesn't make them less effective. And to me, that is the true explanation for why they did that. And I don't like stuff like that personally. I think that whenever you have to kind of make all kinds of excuses in order to make something make sense, and really that the whole point is just because the player gets a different way to express their character that they think is cool in some game mechanic form, I'm sorry, but I would just prefer that you instead load up on magical darts and start throwing them whenever you encounter stuff that's resistant to fire, or just accept the fact that you're going to do a little bit less damage, a lot less damage. Well, let's be true. Um, Sometimes they just seem kind of ill-conceived. Like, for instance, I brought up Mounted Combatant. Whenever you look at Mounted Combatant, you can always just choose whether or not you are attacked or your mount is attacked whenever something tries to attack your mount. And the thing about this that I think is strange is that it defies a lot of the design principles in 5th edition, and I have a hard time making sense of it. And I'll give you an example. Whenever I use the protection fighting style, I am going to make a reaction to protect somebody. Now it imposes disadvantage, so it is a different mechanic. So don't at me with that. But I can only do that I can only do that against one attack per round because I have to use my reaction in order to do it. Whenever we have mounted combatant, it uses nothing. It uses absolutely nothing. So it could be that I'm beset on all sides by all manner of opponents in a 6-second round, and I could effectively prevent them from attacking my horse at all just because I will that to be the case. I think that that's really silly. I think it's just strange. And whenever we just say wholesale, oh yeah, you can absolutely take feats, that means that a lot of people are just gonna say, yeah, mounted combatant's fine. You can absolutely choose that. And then whenever they see it in play, then they may notice those things that it's kind of hard to explain. And if you're like me, and whenever you run combats, you like to be able to describe the action in a way that's not just mechanics, then it can get kind of silly. I mean, it's the same thing with a lot of different things. A lot of people have complained about the up and down, kind of thing with I'm unconscious, now I'm healed. I'm unconscious, now I'm healed. I'm unconscious, now I'm healed. There are all kinds of situations where it can be hard to explain these things. And I think that this is one of them. And I mean, it also works against missiles. If you have people shooting arrows at them, how does that work exactly? How is it that you're preventing these arrows from hitting your steed? Does it say anything about you needing to use a shield? No, it doesn't say anything about that, or a pole arm or something to be able to deflect attacks. You don't even have to have a weapon. You just have to be sitting on a horse, and that's it. People brought up stuff about overpowered options. I don't really care about overpowered options. That's not really a thing that I care about necessarily. And the reason for that is because it's not a player versus player game. It's really not. So I'm not really competing with the players in that way. Whatever rules they have working in their favor, I have working in my favor as well if I'm running the game. So I'm not really concerned about that. I do care about class niche, and that's a whole other discussion. But part of the thing that comes with class niche is the ability to separate player characters in the things that they're good at. Now, some people might say that I have a problem with customization in general, and I'm going to say, no, I really don't have a problem with customization. If a player uses customization features in order to step on another player's toes with their player character, it's that player's fault. If they go out of their way to be the best healer in the party and be the best damage dealer, when they also have a life cleric and an assassin in the party, an assassin rogue, then really it's them that may be the problem, because what they're doing is they may be taking away from those people's ability to do what their character is good at and kind of make them sit in the background. But you should also take note that just because a character is good at everything, it may not mean that they act on it. So if I have all of these abilities, but that's not what I do with my character, then there's not really a problem. The problem is really whenever somebody goes out of their way to be able to be good at everything, and the system allows them to, and they decide that they're going to use that all the time in all kinds of situations, and they make the other people kind of redundant. They're really just there to add to sheer numbers. Then that's whenever you have a problem, and that's really a player problem more so than it is a system problem. I like class niche just because of the fact that whenever we have a fighter, that what the fighter is good at, and the fighter really is good at it. They're the ones that get to attack more frequently. They're the ones that are good with all weapons. They're the ones that can just slay a whole ton of one-hit die creatures, depending on what edition you're playing. There's all kinds of stuff that the fighter can do. In some variants, they could be the only ones that are able to use magic swords at all. And guess what? Magic swords were the best swords. They were the ones that had the intellectual powers and all that kind of stuff, the extraordinary powers. And that made them really special. The magic user was the one that you look to for magic. You know, they were the one that you look to for all kinds of solutions to things that normally you couldn't do. The cleric was the one that you look to turn undead, you know, to make undead flee. And that was something that was really important. You know, whenever you had a lock that needed picking, by golly, you needed a thief for that. It's just not the case anymore. And the more people make their characters to cover every situation, the more likely it's going to be that they're going to have the opportunity to take from other people's stuff, basically. It is a player problem, but not everybody knows how to manage a table. Not everybody knows how to be a conscientious player. And I think that, you know, really, I don't have a problem with customization. What I would like to do is make sure that people know that lack of customization doesn't have to mean cookie cutter. It doesn't have to mean boring. You know, just because I'm playing in a game that the cleric is always going to get this stuff on the next level, and I'm playing a cleric, so that's how it's going to be, doesn't mean that my cleric has to be just like every other cleric in every other way. It doesn't mean that there can't be extra dimensions that are added to the game, whether through the DM incorporating them by choice and not by the fact that it is, you know, here in the rule book that you have to use, and all that kind of stuff. Maybe that's the avenue that we decide to take. Maybe it's just that I like to be able to have some flexibility, and my DM allows that. You know, if you have a game that you trust your DM, then you can do a whole lot of things. Should that be the only recourse? Not necessarily. This is why customization in games is so well loved, is because there are a lot of times that you can use those things to good effect. You can use those things to do things that are cool and, you know, are reinforced by the game mechanics and are an interesting way to deal with the game. But I just want people to know that there are other options out there. So I'm not trying to pee in their cornflakes. You know, I'm not trying to say that you're a bad DM if you don't incorporate. You're not a bad player if you like feats. You're not a bad player if you like subclasses. You're not a bad player if you like Pathfinder. I'm not saying any of those things. What I'm saying is that you can have a very enjoyable, successful game, and you can use your imagination and all that kind of stuff without having to resort to looking at your character sheet for the answers. That's what I wanted to impart with all of this stuff. That's it for this video. I hope y'all have a wonderful day. Feel free to argue with me in the comments if you have any kind of disagreements or anything like that. I'll be happy to hear it. And y'all take care. More videos coming in the future.